Hello, so this is your presentation about cognitive behavioural practice. So we're just going to start off as ever with the roots of cognitive behavioural therapy. So advocates of the cognitive behavioural approach point to the very strong evidence base of the effectiveness of CBT with service users, which brings us back to those debates that we had at the start of the module about evidence-based practice. CBT very much originates in the schools of psychology, which very much come from that kind of positivist tradition. The origins of CBT were behavioural, so with the work of Pavlov and Watson, with Pavlov doing his seminal experiments with dogs in 1897 and John Watson building on that in the early 1900s. So they contended that only overt publicly observable behaviour should be the proper focus of scientific inquiry, and they developed their theory around classical or respondent conditioning or learning. So this idea focuses on an antecedent environmental condition which has come to automatically evoke certain simple motor behaviours or physical reactions. So this was really at the core of the behavioural approach. Following on, you had Thorndike, who broadened the behavioural approach and developed this idea of law and effect that reinforces and punishes of behaviour. So this idea that behaviours can be learned or adjusted based on the consequences, and that's really the idea of operant or instrumental conditioning or learning theory. So that was Thorndike, but Skinner then built on this again in the 1950s when he contended that all functions of the body should be subjected to the experimental analysis of behaviour, including private unobserved events such as pain, thoughts and wishes. So this opened up these ideas to social work because these were quite often the issues that social workers were dealing with. So next we had the development of social learning theory through Albert Bandura and his Bobo doll experiments. So this is the idea that actually individuals learn by observing, replicating and modelling others within their environment. So the likelihood of behaviours being imitated is dependent on the perceived consequences of that behaviour in the environment. So it kind of broadened this idea, bringing in some of those environmental factors. So then you also had the growth of cognitive therapy, and this links to constructivism, the idea that humans construct their experience of reality out of the interaction between their perceptions and ideas about the world. So this recognition or idea that thoughts, feelings and behaviours are all connected. And the two big proponents of cognitive approaches were Albert Ellis in the 1950s, and he wrote about rational emotive behavioural therapy and the idea of the ABC model. And then you had Alan Beck in the 1960s, who did a lot of work about depression and the link between thoughts, feelings and behaviour in relation to depression. And so when cognitive therapy became very popular and kind of took over in popularity from behavioural therapy, there was quite a lot of conflict there, but this latterly has been brought together in cognitive behavioural therapy. So in summary, behavioural therapy focuses on behaviours, cognitive therapy focuses on thoughts, and CBT focuses on the interaction between thoughts and behaviour. So CBT is a therapeutic approach that aims to help resolve a client's difficulties by looking at their thoughts, emotions, physical symptoms and behaviours, including the client's responses to internal and external events. So if we start with some of the fundamental ideas in CBT, the first is information processing in cognition and emotion. So human information processing is selective. When people encounter the world, the human senses register information about the world as codes or representations into working memory. But working memory has limited capacity and storage. So to establish in long-term memory, repetition and rehearsal leads to these representations becoming established in long-term memory. So this idea is that the human brain is not merely a passive receptor, but rather an active agent that selects and appraises information for its contextual meaning or value. And an emotion arises from the selection and appraisal process, meaning that people interpret the meaning of objects for attention by ascribing to them conceptual categories according to their memories of past experiences. These memories are held to be deeply embedded as schemas. So schemas are cognitive structures that actively organise knowledge about past experience, and they begin in early childhood. So schemas are manifested as intermediate assumptions or core beliefs, and this idea of core beliefs is really important within CBT, and they have a strong influence on the self-concept and behaviour. Intermediate assumptions often take the form of if-then statements, such as, if I try hard, I will succeed. So core beliefs are global, overarching and absolute test statements about oneself or about the world. So for example, it might be I'm worthless, or the world is dangerous. So I guess those are highlighting some potentially problematic schemas that some people might hold about themselves that might bring them into contact with a social worker. So moving on to information processing biases. And the cognitive behavioural theory suggests that there are a number of logic or cognitive errors that occur within individuals, and Beck wrote extensively about these and identified several. So for example, selective obstruction is when a conclusion is drawn from a small portion of the available information that would otherwise be incongruent or wouldn't fit with the conclusion, that information is screened out so that we only process and store information that supports a particular schema. So if your schema, for example, is I'm worthless, then there's a chance that you will filter any information that supports that core belief and store it, and anything that contradicts as an anomaly will not be stored. Overgeneralization is seen as another cognitive error, and this is where a conclusion is drawn from an isolated incident and then applied globally to many areas and situations. So again, I'm rubbish, everything is rubbish. It might be that, maybe once you were a little bit rubbish at one thing, but actually you generalise that to everything. Magnification and minimisation is where the significance of an attribute or event is exaggerated or minimised. So these cognitive errors are often expressed in the form of automatic thoughts, and these are thoughts that automatically arise in our minds throughout the day. So they're constantly streaming just below the surface of the conscious mind that go unspoken while we're just getting on with life. They can be revealed by introspection or reflection, and they can be triggered by all sorts of events. So this leads us on to the ABC model, where A stands for an activating event, B relates to the belief system, those automatic thoughts, and C is the consequences. So this is the cognitive behavioural cycle. And the idea behind this cycle is that when an individual encounters a given event, so an activating event, he or she appraises the event for its meaning or personal relevance. So as such, the event activates schemas, which are often in the form of core beliefs, which then produce automatic thoughts. Internal automatic thoughts elicit emotions and lead to behavioural responses. Now, these may arise spontaneously out of habit or result from an intentional process of reflection and decision making. So although this model is represented in a linear fashion, in actuality it is seen as wholly bidirectional, recursive and circular. Emotional and behavioural reactions influence the activating event, as well as modifying the thoughts and beliefs about that event. So this model is really fundamental to thinking about the range of ways we can work with people using the CBT approach. So if we think about social workers and their involvement with CBT, so it may be that social workers are using CBT with service users, usually in specialist settings, so for example mental health or substance use, and in this way it might be in its classic form, time limited and structured, usually be between 10 and 20 sessions. Or it may be that a social worker is combining behavioural or cognitive techniques with other methods. So some of the other approaches that you're learning about on the module might be used in combination with some of the techniques from CBT. Or it may be that you're working with service users who are embarking on a CBT program with other professionals or online. Increasingly CBT is being used online. Thinking about applying CBT within your own practice, there are 3 stages. So stage 1 is the assessment process. Stage 2 is intervention. And stage 3 is evaluation. So in terms of assessment, if you're going to be using CBT, it's really important that you explore how the service user's thoughts, feelings and behaviours are contributing to their presenting problem. So that usually involves using the ABC model and gathering information on the intensity, frequency and duration of the problem in order to get a baseline on which to plan your intervention. Thinking about stage 2, intervention, social workers' role would be to assist the service user in altering behaviours or thought processes to produce a better outcome. So there are a whole range of techniques. The first on here is cognitive restructuring. So there are a number of techniques that can be used to cognitively restructure. Quite often the literature will talk about Socratic questioning, which is a form of questioning in which Socrates helped his students to reach a conclusion without telling them. It might be that you seek evidence through your questioning and counter evidence for the automatic thoughts or core beliefs that a service user might be experiencing. It might be that you use logic to challenge cognitive errors and generate new, more adaptive cognitive appraisals based on the evidence. So, for example, if someone expresses a negative automatic thought, there's a downward arrow technique whereby you might ask, if that thought were true, what would it mean about you as a person? And it starts to assist the service user to sort of unpick some of those automatic thoughts, maybe find the anomalies. Relaxation techniques can be used, so teaching the service user skills for relaxing will help in terms of managing their emotional responses to the activating event. Social skills training, developing assertiveness training, problem solving skills, developing new ways of thinking and behaving that are more helpful and practicing those, works on the kind of behavioural aspect of CBT. Aversion therapy. This is where a service user might be exposed to behaviours or situations, usually the problem behaviour, while simultaneously being exposed to uncomfortable behaviours or sensations. So it might be if you start to become irritated or angry, having something like an elastic band around your wrist that you ping, and it sort of interrupts and raises your awareness of the response that you're having. This idea of kind of systematic desensitization, which is where you might be exposing a service user to anxiety-evoking situations while simultaneously learning these relaxation skills that you've gone through. And there's also the kind of classic reinforcement, so this token economy, rewarding good behaviour, quite regularly used with children and young people, things like star charts, reward charts and those sorts of things. Modelling and role play can also be used within CBT interventions. So I guess this is sort of building on the social learning aspects of CBT and thinking about how you could identify people who might be appropriate role models. It may be that you will model some certain behaviours within your session with the service user, or you might find a mentor who could do this. So the final stage is about evaluation. There's a strong expectation within CBT that there's a process of reviewing and evaluating, so keeping a track of the intensity, duration and frequency of the problem. So you should have got a baseline at the beginning through that assessment process, and then you can check it and keep testing whether the intensity, duration and frequency has shifted at all. And I guess that sort of feeds into this positivist basis for CBT, that actually we need to keep testing the evidence in how we're doing. So these are the references used to support this presentation today, and we will pick up more about CBT in class.